When applicable, hinge cutting is a great tool for the deer habitat manager. Today I want to talk about hinge cutting. In particular, I want to talk about the time of year that I like to hinge cut, and I also want to talk about the types of trees that hinge cut well up in my part of the world. Now, I'm from the northern half of Minnesota. I'm right on the border of growing zone 3, so that limits me a little bit on the types of trees that hinge well, but there are some trees that hinge well up here. So I'm going to talk about the trees that hinge well, the ones that are more marginal, and the type of trees that we just don't hinge cut up here. So stick with me and we'll talk about all things hinge cutting.
I wanted to start this video out by showing how trees hinge cut in cold weather. Now, this day that I recorded this video, it was very, very cold out. And this particular tree that I started with is a basswood, and I wanted to show just how basswood hinge cut in cold weather. Looking up close, you can see I got it to hinge, but with all that splintering that occurred, I do not expect that this tree will likely live. It's hard to cut frozen trees, especially trees that are more marginal, and I would call a basswood a marginal tree for hinge cutting. Now here you can see I dropped the basswood on top of another tree, so that helped to create a hinge. If it would have just free fallen to the ground, it likely would have broken off. Here's a basswood that was hinge cut in the summer, and you can see that this one is still living. You know, as I look down the trunk of the tree here, you can see those fresh red buds growing off the trunk of this hinge basswood tree. Now, in the summer, the bark was much more flexible, more malleable, so it didn't splinter like that winter cut basswood tree, and it was able to create a very nice hinge cut tree. Here I'm attempting to hinge cut a hard maple in the winter. Now, hard maple in general, you're probably going to have a very low success rate getting them to hinge. You can see with the frozen tree that there was really no chance that that was going to be successful. I mean, this is pretty typical. I did a nice flat cut. We always do flat cuts when we're attempting to hinge a tree to get a better and more controlled fall. But that thing it's not very flexible wood with the hard maple, so it was doomed for failure from the beginning. Now here's one that I hinge cut in the summer, and it's a smaller tree. If you try to hinge cut a smaller hard maple, they're going to have a better chance at hinging, and you can see with this one is still alive and actually created a good viable hinge. But the key was I cut this one in the summer when that bark was flexible. Alright, so now here I'm cutting on an ash tree. Your small to medium ash trees can make decent hinges. They can be very hingeable trees, but the key to them is that they need to be healthy trees. If you look up and there is no crown to that tree, or the tree just looks diseased, or there's a lot of dead branches on it, flush cut that tree. Don't attempt to hinge cut that tree, otherwise it can get dangerous. I mean, you can see here there are nice meaty hinges on these ash trees that I cut, and the key is as I drop them with this winter cut, I was dropping them onto other hinged ash trees. If they would have free fallen right to the ground, given how cold it was this day, there was a very good chance that these ash trees would have continued to break off of the trunk instead of actually holding that hinge. Here are some ash trees that were hinge cut in the summer, and you can see I got ample regeneration off the trunk, or the base of the tree, and then ample regeneration off the trunk all the way down. Actually, all these ash trees along this tiny little marsh edge were hinge cut in the summer, and I think they all lived. The hinges healed over, and I was able to get regeneration down the entire trunk of all of these trees. And these ones were cut so that they fell all the way to the ground out into this small marsh. Now, if I would have cut these trees the same way in the winter, I think there's a good chance I would have lost some of them, just because with that cold tree, again, that tree trunk is not very flexible, and I think some of them would have broke off. As I cut these ash trees right here, you can see just how slow these trees fall. You know, one, with that bark being more flexible, they fall slower, and the other thing, as they're falling, those leaves are gripping and grabbing on to those trees I'm falling them up against, slowing the descent of that tree. In the winter, when all those leaves aren't on the trees do tend to fall faster, but if I can brush these trees up against other trees in the summer when I'm hinge cutting them, it really does slow that descent and makes for a much nicer hinge, a more controlled hinge, and a safer hinge. And that's a big piece of this, is safety. I mean, watch as this tree falls. You can see it. I mean, it doesn't come crashing down to the ground super fast, and it makes a nice, big, beautiful hinge. All right, so here's an elm tree. Elm are probably the best hinging tree in Minnesota. You could cut these winter, spring, summer, fall, and no matter the temp, I think you're going to get a nice hinge off these trees. That bark or that wood is just very flexible, and I pretty much, as long as it's not hollow in the middle, I pretty much always get a nice hinge off of elm trees. All right, this one is Boxelder, and Boxelder are another really nice hinging tree. They heal over really nicely after you make that hinge cut, and you get a lot of regeneration off that trunk. And you can see, because of the nice hinges in this spot, I was able to actually make some nice canopied beds with these Boxelders. I kind of stacked a bunch up on top of each other and made a nice canopied bed underneath them. Here's another Boxelder. You can see even the top looks dead, but there is regeneration coming all the way down that trunk. Boxelder are often leaning one direction or another, so they're easy to predict which way they're going to fall. And yeah, these do hinge really nicely. And the only time they don't really make a good hinge is, again, if it's a tree that's kind of dead or on its way out. Now, here's a hinge tree that is dead. This one obviously didn't make it through, so I just put this in the video to show that they don't always, not every hinge tree is going to live, but even with this one, it kept the cover propped up, so it's still adding a little structure in my bedding area. Here's a quick video just to show how much regeneration can be in a hinge cut bedding area. I mean, we're still getting tons and tons of woody stems sprouting because of the sunlight we added. So here I'm hinge cutting a Boxelder, and I wanted to show what happens a lot when you have a tree that's leaning hard. You can see that this tree split all the way down to the base of the tree. When I do a close-up look here, you're going to see that it's not a great hinge, and the tree's also not very healthy. So this tree would have been much better off just being flush cut, so I can keep the stump sprouts in the deer's face.
One tip when you're hinge cutting: use a small saw. It's just easier to handle. And then you can see here I got my T435. With a saw like this, I know I'm not going to tempt myself to cut something or hinge cut something that's too big. That could seriously hurt me. That's what I always tell guys. Say, you hinge cut trees that you can handle. You know, if it's a tree that could seriously hurt you or even kill you, those are the trees to avoid, especially when you haven't done much of this. I mean, you want trees that you can easily handle, and that's why I like to use a smaller saw like this with the 14-inch bar, because then I know I'm not gonna cut something I shouldn't be cutting, and I'm not gonna get nearly as tired. And when we get tired in the woods, that's when we get dangerous with the saw. So I use a smaller one.
Even though I'll probably get hate mail for it, I will say that your younger bur oaks do make a very nice hinge. You can see here I hinge cut a couple of bur oaks, and they're still alive. Generally, I'm only going to hinge cut a bur oak when I'm trying to help out other adjacent oaks. I have two oaks around these two that I hinge cut that I wanted to release, and this is a bedding area, so I decided to hinge them to create good cover at the deer's level. Now, do not cut on any oaks during your oak wilt window. Here in Minnesota, the oak wilt window is from April to July, so I do my oak cutting in the winter. And I am on properties sometimes that are predominantly bur oaks, so sometimes we got to cut some oaks on those properties to put cover back in the deer's face. So just a quick recap, trees that I like to hinge cut here in Minnesota. My top two, number one is elm, number two is Boxelder. Trees that are more marginal for hinge cutting would be ash, basswood, and maybe your small hard maples. Even your smaller soft maples hinge okay. Ironwood do make a nice hinge. They often die, so I would put them in the marginal category, but I also like to primarily flush cut ironwood because they stump sprout so well and they hold their leaves well into winter, making good cover that way. Trees that do not hinge well would be cottonwood, aspen, birch, conifers. You don't want to hinge any type of conifer. Red oak. Those are all trees that are very, they will die if you try to hinge them. So it's best to be cedar, any type of conifer. You don't want to be hinge cutting. So yeah, and I also prefer to hinge cut in the summer over winter just because I get better hinges, but you can get a decent hinge in the winter if you have the right conditions. Generally, if you're cutting in the winter, you want it to be a little bit warmer. It'd be nice if it was above freezing. You're going to have a much better chance at success with that hinge cut tree.
I had to add the audio on this video later because it is freaking cold today. I wanted to show what it's like to cut trees cold. It's -30 wind chill today. We're supposed to actually bump up to close to -50 in the next couple of days. So I'm cutting in these videos. I'm cutting frozen trees just to show what it's like to cut them cold. But anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and y'all take care. God bless.